Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of history to meet the men who walked unseen, the quiet guardians who held the fate of a kingdom in their hands. They were the watchers of the night, the whisperers between chiefdoms, the ones who saw the enemy before the sun had even touched their faces. This is the story of the Zulu warrior, scouts the eyes and ears of the king, who moved like wind through tall grass and vanished like smoke over the ridges. They lived in the darkness so others could march in the light. And though the songs of battle echo through history, theirs are the songs few remember, quiet, breathless, but absolutely vital. Let's travel now to a land of ridged valleys and rolling mist, to a time when the heartbeat of a nation was measured not by the clash of shields, but by the silent footsteps of a scout slipping through the dark. The year could have been 1828 or 1836, or any of those years when empires trembled under the weight of a single message. A message carried not by drums or horns, but by one man running barefoot through the night. He carried not just intelligence, but fate itself, the rise or fall of warriors, the breath of victory, or the whisper of doom. Under the rule of kings like Shaka, Kasanzanga Konadingan, and Impad, these scouts were the unseen power behind every campaign. They moved days ahead of the main army, mapping out the safest routes, noting the flow of rivers for crossings, counting the enemy's cattle, and watching their fires flicker on distant hills. To fail in this task meant not only death for oneself, but a catastrophic disaster for thousands of warriors following behind. Their reward wasn't songs or gold. It was something far more valuable: trust, the silent, profound respect of the king who relied on them completely, and the unspoken fear of those who envied their closeness to power. Let us imagine, just for a moment, that we are sitting round a low fire at dusk. The flames flicker gently, casting long, dancing shadows on the earth. An elder's voice rises, calm and deep, telling us what it truly meant to walk alone beneath a moon that watched all things but told no one. You can hear the faint hiss of burning wood, the night crickets weaving their slow, ancient rhythm, and the distant, gentle sound of cattle bells settling for the night. This is where our story begins, not on the battlefield, but in the silence before it. Not in the roar of thousands, but in the steady, controlled breath of one who listens. The life of a scout, an asterisk in lowly asterisk, began long before he ever set foot in enemy territory. It started in boyhood, with games that were more than just games. They were lessons in survival. A young boy learned to read the land as if it were an open book. A broken twig wasn't just a broken twig. It told him who passed, how many, and how long ago. The flight of a bird wasn't random. It was a signal, a warning of movement in the brush below. He learned to mimic the calls of night animals, to blend his presence with the natural sounds of the wild. His training was relentless. He would run for miles, his lungs burning, his feet toughening on the sharp stones and thorny ground of the veldt. He learned to go without food for days, surviving on what little the land offered: roots, insects, wild berries. He practiced holding his breath for minutes at a time, a skill that could mean the difference between life and death when hiding just feet away from an enemy patrol. His senses were honed to a razor's edge. He could smell rain on a dry wind, feel the faint vibrations of distant footsteps through the soles of his feet, and see movement in the dark that others would miss entirely. This wasn't just physical training. It was a spiritual and mental conditioning. He learned to master his fear, to turn it into a tool for heightened awareness. Loneliness was his constant companion, silence his closest friend. He had to be patient, capable of staying perfectly still for hours, observing a single spot, waiting for that one crucial piece of information. The asterisk in lowly asterisk was chosen for his intelligence, his incredible stamina, and above all, his unwavering loyalty. He had to be incorruptible, a man who understood that the knowledge he carried was more precious than any herd of cattle. The king's trust in him was absolute, and betraying that trust was an unthinkable crime. Once chosen, his mission would begin. Stripped of all but the most essential gear, a small shield, a single throwing spear, or assegai, and a small pouch of provisions, he would slip away from the main encampment under the cover of darkness. He was a ghost, a whisper on the wind. His task was to move deep into enemy territory, often alone or with just one trusted partner. He needed to find the enemy's main force, assess its size, its composition, and its state of readiness. Where were their kraals located? How were they defended? Where did they water their cattle? Was their morale high or low? He listened to conversations from the shadows, piecing together fragments of information. He would climb the highest peaks, the asterisk, Intaba, asterisk, to get a vantage point. Sketching maps in the dirt or memorizing the entire landscape with photographic precision. Every detail mattered. The number of huts, the placement of sentries, the state of their crops, it all painted a picture that the king's generals would use to plan their attack. The journey back was often more perilous than the journey out. Now, he wasn't just a scout. He was a hunted man carrying vital intelligence. He had to evade trackers, navigate treacherous terrain at speed, and push his body to its absolute limit. He would run for days, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs, driven by the urgency of his message. The fate of his people, his brothers in the army, rested on his speed and his ability to get back to the king before the enemy could react. When he finally stumbled back into the royal kraal, exhausted and covered in dust, he would be brought directly before the king and his council. There, in a quiet, measured voice, he would deliver his report. No exaggeration, no guesswork, only the facts. He would describe the terrain, the enemy's numbers, their exact location, and their weaknesses. Based on his word, an entire army of thousands would be set in motion. A successful campaign brought honor not just to the warriors, but to the silent scout who made their victory possible. His name might not be sung in the great war chants, but in the quiet nod of the king, he received the highest honor of all. These were the Zulu scouts, men of quiet courage, whose legacy is etched not in stone, but in the rolling hills and deep valleys they once roamed. They remind us that the greatest strength is not always found in the loudest roar, but in the quietest footstep. Thank you for joining us on this journey under Baobab skies. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the heart of Africa. Until next time, stay curious. You are now under Baobab skies, and the story begins now. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why being a Zulu scout was both a profound honor and a terrible cursor role that demanded absolute silence, unimaginable sacrifice, and a constant, terrifying dance with death. Imagine this for a moment. You're not chosen because you are the strongest or the fastest warrior. You're chosen because you are the most invisible. You are the one who knows how to breathe with the wind, how to make your own heartbeat match the ancient rhythm of the land. You are trusted with secrets that could decide the fate of a kingdom, yet you cannot speak them. You see things others will never see, and yet you must pretend you never saw them at all. The life of a Zulu scout was built on a foundation of solitude. While other warriors in their regiments trained together, ate together, and sang the powerful songs of the impi before dawn parades, the scout was sent away. He walked alone into the vast, unforgiving wild, often barefoot, sometimes for weeks at a time, with nothing but a short spear and a small cowhide shield for company. His mission was simple in its instruction, but impossibly complex in its execution. To observe without being seen, to report without being caught, to walk where no one else dared to follow. The first and most immediate challenge was exposure. The scouts slept in the open, no huts, no fires, no comfort. A small, shallow hollow in the ground might serve as a bed. A pile of dry grass, if he was lucky, as a blanket. He couldn't risk the faintest wisp of smoke from a fire revealing his position, or a single misplaced footprint betraying his trail. The Zulu heartland, the rolling hills of what is now KwaZulu-Natal, was not a kind place for the unprepared. The landscape itself was an adversary, hills thick with thornbush that could tear flesh, grasslands with blades sharp enough to cut, and nights that grew so cold they could stiffen fingers around a spear shaft, snakes coiled under rocks, waiting, hyenas sniffed through the dark, drawn by any scent. And sometimes an enemy patrol passed so close in the blackness that you could hear the soft whisper of their breathing. A sound that would stop your own heart in your chest. Why did they do it? It's a question many asked, even among their own regiments. Why would anyone choose this life? Some whispered that the scouts were born strange half-spirit, half-man, existing in a world between. Others said they were chosen by the ancestors, touched by something that allowed them to move between the world of the living and the world of shadows. But the truth was simpler, and in many ways much sadder. They did it because the king commanded it. Because in the iron discipline of the Zulu impi, obedience wasn't just a virtue, it was life itself. And because for every scout who vanished into the wild, consumed by the land or the enemy, there were dozens who survived. And these survivors returned with knowledge that could save 1,000 others. The kingdom of Shaka Zulu was built on information as much as it was built on spears. Before a single regiment marched, before the first war chant echoed through the valleys, the scouts were already gone. They were out there, tracing rivers, counting enemy cattle, and noting the terrain with painstaking detail. They would find the perfect place for an ambush, the safest river crossing, and even the likely paths an enemy might use to retreat. Their work was the unseen foundation of every victory. Sometimes their missions required even greater audacity. They'd hide in the branches of trees above enemy homesteads for days on end, silent and still, listening to conversations, gathering whispers that would shape entire wars. On other occasions, they would sneak into enemy patrols, disguised as weary travelers or wandering herdsmen, their true purpose hidden behind a mask of humility. But the danger was a constant, suffocating presence. A captured scout faced no mercy, torture, a slow and agonizing death, and the dishonor of betrayal haunted every single step. To be caught meant more than just losing your life. It meant losing your name. The Zulu did not honor failure, especially when the stakes were so high. Some scouts were tasked with the most perilous missions of all, traveling far beyond their own borders into lands ruled by rival chiefdoms or the newly arrived Boer settlers. In these foreign territories, the wrong word, a misplaced accent, or a single, unfamiliar gesture could expose them instantly. They would disguise themselves in foreign attire, cover their distinctively shaped Zulu shields, and even rub ash into their skin to appear dusted and weary. Just another wanderer on a long road. Every journey was a gamble. One misstep on a rocky outcrop, one careless word in a strange village, one snapped twig in the dead of night could mean death. And still, they pressed on. They didn't do it for gold, or for praise, or for songs to be sung in their name. They did it because their silence was their service. Their invisibility was their weapon. A Zulu scout had to master the art of becoming a ghost. He learned how to walk backward to confuse trackers. A simple but brilliant trick. He learned how to bury his footprints in loose sand or soft earth, and how to breathe so shallowly that even the tall grass around him would not sway and betray his presence. He memorized the constellations to navigate by night and watched the behavior of birds, knowing that their sudden flight could signal enemy movement long before it was visible. In his world, everything spoke. The wind whispered secrets through the grass. The dust on the ground told stories of who had passed. The cry of a distant jackal could mean many things, and the scout had to learn to understand them all. He was not just an observer of the land, he was a student of its language. The profound loneliness of this life could bend a man's mind. Days, sometimes weeks, without speaking to another soul, could make some men forget how to use words at all. They became strange, even to their own people. They were hyper-alert, always listening, their eyes constantly scanning, as if the land itself was whispering directly to them. Among the other warriors, the scouts were both admired and feared. They were treated almost like spirits, men who were too familiar with death to belong entirely to the world of the living. When they returned from their missions, gaunt and silent, they often sat apart from the others during the evening songs and celebrations. Their experiences set them apart, creating an invisible wall between them and their comrades. There was a saying that circulated among the regiments, a phrase that perfectly captured their isolation: "A man who walks with shadows eats alone." In the royal kraal, however, the scouts were held in the highest, albeit quietest, esteem. Shaka himself was said to have walked among them, personally testing their alertness. He would drop a spear behind a guard or move soundlessly through a camp at night, waiting to see who noticed. A true scout, they said, could feel danger even with his eyes closed. He could sense a change in the air, a shift in the world around him. And so, the scout lived between two worlds, honored by his king, yet avoided by his comrades, and forever haunted by the silence that ensured his own survival. By the time the first light of dawn broke and the great army began its march, the scout was already far ahead. His body was light, his mind was sharp as a blade, and his eyes were hardened by countless sleepless nights. He already knew every ridge and ravine, every watering hole and hidden path that lay ahead. He had already seen where men would die sometimes. He had marked the ground himself. That was the terrible burden of his calling, to know what others did not, to carry knowledge too heavy for any man's peace of mind, and to walk always, always just beyond the reach of home. Tomorrow we will follow his trail even deeper into the world of his training and techniques, where the body and the mind were forged into instruments of silent, deadly service. The sun moved slow across the African sky, burning through the thin mist that clung to the morning hills. Beneath it, two dark figures walked in silent shadows, wrapped in hides, their spears resting lightly on their shoulders. They were not soldiers today. They were Amakafela, they listeners. Their task was not to fight, but to feel the land breathe, to notice when the birds grew too quiet, or when a puff of dust rose on the distant horizon, signs that something or someone was moving. In the Zulu kingdom, these quiet watchers were the first eyes of the army, and often the last line between life and invasion. Each pair of scouts was chosen not just for their strength, but for their temperament. You couldn't survive these long, lonely paths if you spoke too much. You needed patience like a stone, and eyes that could drink the world in without judgment. So, they sent men in pairs, never more than 3, to become each other's shadow, each other's breath. In the cold dawn, one would listen while the other slept. At dusk, They would switch, one cooking a thin porridge over a hidden ember, the other keeping watch for the faint crack of a branch. No words were ever wasted. Everything essential was said with the eyes or with a simple gesture of the hand. Over time, the bond between these scouts deepened into something unspoken, almost sacred. In the immense silence of the veldt, friendship wasn't built through loud laughter or grand storytelling. It was forged in trust. When you walk for days on end with only one companion beside you, sharing hunger, thirst, and the constant hum of danger, you begin to understand what true brotherhood really means. There were no medals for these men, no songs would carry their names into legend. But in the secret corners of Zulu memory, it was said, "A man who walks with a listener never walks alone." Their reward wasn't glory. It was seeing another sunrise together. At night, the air turned cold and sharp. The scouts would hide their small fire under rocks or in dry riverbeds, letting only a faint glow breathe through the cracks in the earth. It was then, huddled close, that they spoke, their words muffled by the vast blanket of night. They told stories not of glory or women or cattle but of the stars. Each star had a meaning. One marked the beginning of winter, another pointed the way home. The elders had taught them that the stars were the eyes of their ancestors, watching over the land, whispering which way to go when the trails vanished into shadow. Sometimes, a young apprentice might ask softly, "Can the stars see us when we crawl in the dark?" The elder would nod, his own eyes fixed on the heavens. "They see everything," he'd reply, "even the fear you hide in your chest." It was a quiet reminder that they were never truly alone, that they were part of a lineage stretching back into the sky itself. This apprenticeship was never formal. There were no schools, no scrolls, no drills shouted by captains. The veldt itself was the classroom. The wind taught direction, the antelope taught silence, the river taught patience. When a new scout joined an experienced one, the first lesson came not in words, but in watching. How to read a footprint in the dust, how to know if the person who made it was walking or running, hungry or tired, alone or being followed. He learned how to listen to silence and tell whether it meant peace or impending danger. The elder might pause, pointing to the ground. "You see that broken twig?" He'd whisper, "The mark is new. Someone passed here before the dew dried." And the young scout would nod, his eyes wide, slowly beginning to understand that survival here depended not on brute bravery, but on noticing what everyone else ignored. Days bled into nights, and nights bled back into days. Their bodies became lean, carved by distance and discipline. They learned to sleep lightly, to eat sparingly, and to move like the wind over grass. Sometimes, when the midday heat was too much to bear, they'd rest under the shade of a thorn, try not to sleep, but to listen. Listening was everything. The veldt was full of small conversations, the whisper of wind over reeds, the sudden fading of birdsong, the distant bellow of cattle. Each sound meant something, and each silence meant even more. And so, they learned to live inside that subtle language of whispers, becoming a part of the landscape itself. But there was humor too, though it was soft and fleeting. When an unexpected downpour caught them unprepared, they might laugh like children, running through it with their cloaks pulled over their heads. When one of them accidentally burned the porridge, the other would just shake his head, muttering that even the fire pit pitied his cooking. These small moments a shared, quiet laugh, a refreshing gulp of rainwater became the only light in an otherwise dangerous and demanding life. They carried only simple tools, a water skin, a small knife, a hide bag with some dried meat. Each item was precious, earned, and carefully maintained. That knife might cut meat one day, be used as a signaling mirror the next, or carve a secret mark into a tree to guide those who followed. They moved through the world like ghosts, leaving no footprints that would stay for long. And when danger finally came, as it so often did, there was no panic, only a practiced, silent rhythm. One man would signal with a soft hiss, the other would instantly melt into the bush. Every movement was pre-rehearsed, not through drills, but through instinct, honed over countless silent hours spent watching and surviving together. They knew the ways of enemy scouts, the distinct smell of horses on the wind, the faint glint of distant metal under the sun. They read the world like a book, but this book had no letters, only sounds, tracks, and the ever-shifting moods of the wind. To be a scout was to accept invisibility. The glory of the warrior belonged to others, to the men who charged and sang and died beneath the king's banners. But the scouts knew the quiet truth that even the fiercest battle, the most glorious victory, depended entirely on what they saw first, in the quiet. Sometimes, when the night grew to still and the moon was high, fear would creep in like a cold shadow. They would remember home, the voices of their mothers, the laughter of their children, the smell of wet earth after a cleansing rain. And for just a brief second, the scouts became human again. Not just watchers or warriors, but sons. The elder would often break the silence softly. "Do not think too long of home," he'd say. "The heart is a loud drum, the enemy might hear it." The young scout would smile faintly, rubbing the weariness from his eyes. But they both knew it was that very heart, that connection to home, that gave them the strength to endure, even when the body begged to rest. At dawn, they would rise again. There was no trumpet, no ceremony. The land itself gave the signal. A faint blush on the eastern horizon, the distant call of an ibis. They walked on, heads bowed slightly, their long shadows stretching out before them like the ghosts of all the scouts who came before. Theirs was not a loud life. It was a rhythm of breathing, moving, surviving, and remembering. Each day was a test of patience. Each night, a lesson in endurance. And through it all, their brotherhood endured, quiet, loyal, and completely invisible to the loud noise of history. Because in the great Zulu kingdom, not every hero carried a spear to the front lines. Some of them carried silence, and it was that silence that kept their kingdom safe. The life of a Zulu scout was a thread stretched tight between two worlds, the glory of the kingdom and the lonely silence of death. One misstep, one broken twig, one careless breath, and that thread could snap before the next dawn. To exist in such a delicate balance demanded more than courage. It demanded a complete surrender. Every step taken beyond the safety of the kraal, the village walls, was a quiet promise made to the ancestors. If I do not return, let the kingdom live on in my place. They walked with the heavy knowledge that no one would mourn them loudly if they fell. There would be no memorial drums, no cattle slaughtered in remembrance. The vast African veldt would simply reclaim them. The dust would swallow their footprints, and the wind would carry their names into nothingness, as if they had never been. For a Zulu warrior, honor was not earned by how you fought, but by how you obeyed, how you endured, and how you carried the heavy burden of duty. But for a scout, that silence could be a death sentence. They were forbidden from engaging the enemy unless explicitly ordered. If discovered, capture meant unimaginable torture. If they returned alive but having failed their mission, it meant a disgrace, worse than death, sometimes even execution by the king's command. It was said that the ground itself judged a scout. If the dust clung too long to his feet when he returned, perhaps he had wandered where he shouldn't have. If his eyes shifted too often when questioned by the king's advisors, perhaps his courage had cracked under the strain of solitude. The razor's edge wasn't just on the path ahead. It lived inside his own mind, a constant test of his will. Let's pause here for a moment. Let the fire fade low, and feel a soft wind move through the grass. The scout's world was one of profound isolation, and fear was his constant companion. Not the loud, heart-pounding fear of battle, but the quiet, creeping kind, the kind that whispers at the very edge of your thoughts when you are utterly alone. Weeks spent in the wilderness, sometimes alone or in pairs, could blur the lines of reality. The wind would begin to sound like voices. Shadows would move in the periphery where nothing should be. Some believed the land itself tested a man's spirit, showing him the ghosts of those who had failed before him. A gallery of forgotten souls. The older, more experienced scouts would warn the young ones. If you start hearing the veldt talk back to you, it's time to head home. But not all made it that far. Some simply disappeared into the hills, wandering until hunger or madness finally took them. Others did return, but they were changed. They would walk among their brothers again, but their eyes never truly came back from the wilderness. To guard against this creeping madness, many scouts turned to the Izangomar, the diviners, the spiritual healers who spoke with spirits and understood the language of herbs and dreams. Before departing on a mission, a scout would kneel before an Izangoma. They would sprinkle powdered roots and sacred ash on his chest, murmuring blessings in low, rhythmic tones. A small charm, an izibongo, would be tied around his arm or hidden in his travel bag. It might be a simple strip of leather, a colored bead, or a tiny piece of carved bone. This charm was said to carry protection from unseen forces, not from arrows or bullets, but from the malevolent eyes of those who meant him harm. These charms were far more than simple superstition. They were anchors for the spirit, a lifeline in the overwhelming emptiness. When the wind whispered too loudly in the dead of night, or the stars seemed to shift and rearrange themselves in the vast sky, the scout would touch the charm and remember, I am not alone. It was a powerful reminder that he carried his ancestors in his blood, that their strength was his, even in the loneliest, most desolate places on earth. Let's pause again for a moment. Listen as the diviner's song drifts softly in the dark, the rattle of bones marking the passage of faith and the quiet strength it provides. But sometimes the most immediate danger didn't come from a foreign enemy or the ghosts of the veldt. Sometimes it came from within their own ranks. Jealousy was a potent poison in the kraal. A warrior who envied a scout's closeness to the king, or the trust placed in him, might whisper that the scout had failed his mission. Or worse, that he had lied about what he'd seen, exaggerating a threat to gain favor, or concealing a failure to avoid punishment. In such times, the truth didn't always matter. The king's word was final, absolute, and a carefully maintained silence was the only way to survive. It was a cruel irony. The very same silence that made a man a good scout could also destroy him. If accused, he could not defend himself too boldly without seeming insolent and disrespectful to the king. If he remained too quiet, he appeared guilty. And so, he learned to stand perfectly still, a shadow among men, trusting that the ancestors would judge his heart more fairly than his king ever could. When a scout returned from a successful mission, there was no cheering, no celebratory feast. He would enter the kraal silently, his feet bare, his spear lowered in a sign of respect. If the mission had gone well, the king would acknowledge him with a simple nod. That small gesture, lasting only a second, was worth more than gold. To the scout, that nod was everything. It meant life, it meant trust, and it meant the silent continuation of his sacred duty. He would then sit among his regiment, but always slightly apart. The other warriors respected the invisible line that separated him from them. He had walked with the wind and stared into the abyss, and they knew it. No one asked questions. No one celebrated. He had returned from the liminal space between worlds, and to disturb that profound stillness was to tempt fate. Let's pause once more. The crawl is quiet now, the smoke from the morning fires rising like silent prayers into the pale sky. The truth was simple and stark. Most scouts did not live long enough to grow old. They were tools of knowledge for the kingdom, sharpened and used until they inevitably broke. Yet, among themselves, they found a strange and profound peace in that truth. For them, death was not a tragedy to be feared. It was simply part of the song of service, the final note in a life lived for others. The elders would say, when a scout dies far from home, his spirit does not wander lost. It becomes the wind that guides the others who follow. And so they feared less for themselves and more for the silence that would follow if they were gone. Because when the last of the scouts disappeared, the kingdom would be left blind and vulnerable. At times, deep in the night, after a successful mission, a scout might sit alone by a hidden fire and think about the faces he would never see again. Brothers lost to ambushes in thick bush. Companions left behind in foreign valleys, their bodies never to be recovered. Each life lost weighed quietly on his soul. He would whisper their names into the darkness, letting the wind carry them away. There were no tears, no lamentations, only breath, only memory. For in their unspoken code, remembrance was not a loud public display. It was a steady internal flame. And in that steadiness, they found their own form of immortality. In time, even the bravest scouts became legends only to a few. The great battles they helped win by providing critical intelligence, the devastating ambushes they prevented, those victories were celebrated, but never their names. The kingdom thrived on their silence, yet it forgot the men who mastered it. Such was the paradox of their glory, to serve so well that the world forgets you ever existed, and yet they carried no bitterness in their hearts. For they knew that true honor was not found in being remembered by the crowds, but in the quiet knowledge that they had kept their people safe, even if those people never knew the price that was paid. When the elders spoke of great warriors, they spoke of those who bled in open daylight, their bravery witnessed by all. But when they spoke of the scouts, they lowered their voices, as if sharing a sacred secret. The scouts' stories belonged to the wind and the rustling grass, not to the loud, beating drums of history. As the first light of dawn rose over the ridges, a single scout walked home. His steps were light on the earth, but his heart was still heavy from what he had seen in the darkness. He would report to his king, speak only the few words that were necessary, and then disappear again into the fabric of the world. No praise, no celebration, just another silent duty completed beneath the watchful eyes of the ancestors. And as the village slowly awoke, no one noticed the quiet man fading back into the hills. His path was invisible, his name unknown, yet his service was written in the safety of every sleeping kraal, in the peaceful breath of every child. For every song of victory that was ever sung, there was a scout whose name the wind alone remembered. In every Zulu homestead, some boys grew restless with the noise of the kraal, the clatter of wooden pails, the bark of dogs, the songs of warriors returning from battle. They didn't run from the sounds, but they found something more compelling in the spaces between them. The pause just before a powerful drumbeat, the still air between two gusts of wind sweeping across the plains. It was these boys the elders noticed. Their eyes lingered longer on distant hills, tracing lines no one else saw. They spoke softly, even when their hearts were full of excitement. Most importantly, they listened far more than they talked. Those were the ones chosen to walk the silent road, the path of the scout. The training did not begin with the weight of a spear or the pull of a bowstring. It began with stillness. For days, an elder would lead a small group of these chosen boys deep into the bush. There, surrounded by the hum of life, they were instructed to do nothing but sit. They sat in silence and observed the world around them with a focus they had never known. They watched the twitch of an impala's ear, a signal of unseen danger. They studied the sudden, explosive leap of a mongoose, a master of surprise. They held their breath with the hawk as it paused in the sky, a moment of perfect calculation before it dived. A scout's first lesson was not how to move, but how to become so still that the world forgot he was there, to vanish without ever leaving, to breathe without being heard. The silence is not empty, the elders would say, their voices a low murmur, like the wind through the tall grass. It speaks, but only if you learn how to listen. And so they did. They listened until the chirping of crickets became a language, until the rustle of leaves told a story. The lessons were intensely practical, yet they were deeply spiritual too. Each breath was a conscious act, counted and controlled. Each step was a deliberate placement, its location and sound memorized. They learned to command their own bodies, even their hearts, slowing the frantic rhythm of fear or excitement until the pounding vanished, swallowed by the symphony of the veldt. In this way, they didn't just hide in the land. They became part of the land itself. Their presence faded into the background, like a stone resting among other stones, a shadow in a field of shadows. Legends grew around these silent figures. Some said the greatest scouts could pass through a herd of sleeping cattle, their warmth and scent mingling with the animals without waking even one. Others claimed they could crawl for hours toward an enemy camp, their bodies becoming so indistinguishable from the earth beneath them that a passing warrior might step right over them, feeling nothing more than a slight rise in the ground. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine the fire flickering low, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the hut. The night air hums with the steady chorus of crickets, a sound that is both everything and nothing. As the boys grew older and their control over stillness became second nature, they were tested by endurance. The training shifted from quiet observation to relentless movement. They would run barefoot at night, guided only by the silver light of the moon. Sometimes the runs were 4 miles across rugged terrain. Sometimes they ran until their legs trembled with exhaustion and their lungs burned for air. This wasn't to build muscle. Warriors trained for that. This was to harden the spirit. A scout could not rely on comfort, for comfort was the sworn enemy of alertness. In the field, there would be no soft bed, no warm meal, only the mission. By the time the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky, they would reach a river, their feet often bloodied, but their eyes bright and clear. The ordeal was a lesson. They learned to find water in the pitch dark, to drink from cupped hands without a splash, to move without fear of the unseen creatures that shared the night. In those long, breathless hours, they began to truly understand that silence was not weakness. It was power. It was control. It was the ultimate advantage. The elders believed that to serve as a scout, one must first belong to the land. You could not simply pass through it. You had to be accepted by it. And so, the boys learned the texture of every hill, the feel of different soils beneath their feet. They learned the smell of rain on dry earth, a promise of life and a sign of changing weather. They could taste the wind before a storm, a shift in the air that told them what was coming. Their world became a living map, not one drawn on hide or bark, but one written into their memory, their senses, and their very instinct. A ridge wasn't just a landmark. It was a vantage point. A stream wasn't just water. It was a path, a barrier, or a source of sound to mask their own. By the time a boy could walk without casting a shadow just before dawn, moving with the pre-light stillness of the world itself, he was deemed ready for the next test, the silence of thought. This was the final crucible, a trial of the mind. He was made to sit for a full day and a full night, from one sunrise to the next, without speaking, eating, or moving more than his breath allowed. It was a battle against his own thoughts, his own hunger, his own impatience. Only the strongest endured. Many failed, their minds wandering, or their bodies giving in to the urge to move. For those who did succeed, the reward was deceptively simple: an elder's slow, deliberate nod, a sign of profound respect. It was the same nod the king would one day give his most trusted scouts before sending them into the unknown. Let's pause here again. The young ones in the village sleep beside the dying embers of the fire. The sounds of the night creatures rise and fall like a gentle, breathing tide, a constant reminder of the life that thrives in the darkness. Once a scout had mastered the silence of body and mind, his training entered its final, most critical phase, the art of seeing what is meant to be hidden. He was now a ghost, a whisper in the wind, but that was only half the skill. The other half was to perceive the world with an acuity others could not fathom. The elders would take him to a seemingly empty patch of veldt. "What do you see?" they would ask. A novice saw grass and rocks, but the trained scout saw more. He saw a single blade of grass bent against the wind, a sign that something had passed that way. He noticed a pebble overturned, its darker, damp side facing the sun, indicating it had been disturbed very recently. He learned the subtle languages of the wild. A flock of birds suddenly taking flight from a treetop could mean a predator or a man was moving below. The sudden stop of the cicada's song could signal a presence nearby, something that had startled them into silence. He could look at an abandoned campsite and read its story. The warmth of the ashes told him how long ago the fire was put out. The way the grass was flattened told him how many people had rested there and for how long. The faintest of tracks, invisible to an ordinary eye, revealed whether they were carrying heavy loads, whether they were moving with haste or leisure, and even the tribe they might belong to, based on the wear of their sandals. This was the scout's true value. He was not a warrior who brought back victory in battle. He was an observer who brought back truth. His reports would determine the movement of entire armies, the safety of entire villages. A single mistake, a misread sign, could lead to disaster. But a piece of accurate information, delivered swiftly and silently, was more valuable than 100 spears. He was the eyes and ears of the king, the silent guardian who saw the storm before the first drop of rain fell. His purpose was not to fight, but to ensure that if a fight was necessary, his people would have the advantage of knowledge. To complete his transformation, the scout had to understand the mind of his enemy. He learned to think like a raider, like a hunter, like a rival scout. He would be sent on simulated missions, tasked with infiltrating his own village without being detected. He had to learn the rhythms of his own people from the outside. When the guards changed, when the dogs were least alert, when the village was at its most vulnerable, it was a strange and difficult task. To look upon the familiar with the eyes of a stranger, an adversary, but it taught him empathy in the most practical sense, the ability to anticipate the actions and thoughts of others. Finally, after years of this relentless, all-encompassing training, the boy was no longer a boy. He was something else entirely. He moved with the grace of a leopard, saw with the sharpness of an eagle, and listened with the patience of the ancient stones. He was a living part of the wild, yet his loyalty was to his people. His last test was often a solitary journey, a long patrol into unknown territory from which he had to return with a specific piece of information, the location of a rare herd of animals, the state of a distant water source, or the presence of a new settlement. When he returned, not with a trophy, but with a quiet, factual report delivered to the elders, his training was complete. He would be given his own small shield and a single, light spear not for fighting, but for defense. His true weapon was the silence he commanded and the knowledge he possessed. He was now a scout, a silent protector, a keeper of the paths. His life was one of solitude and immense responsibility, a sacred duty carried out in the quiet spaces most people never even notice. To a scout, every mark on the ground was a sentence waiting to be read. A footprint could tell the story of a man's weight, his speed, and even his fear. A broken twig could speak of how long ago someone passed. The shifting of soil told whether it was friend or foe, hunter or hunted. In this way, scouts became readers of the earth, fluent in a language that most of us have long forgotten. They were trained to notice what others ignored. The precise way a blade of grass leaned after being stepped on, the faintest smell of ash carried on the wind, even the silence of birds, for when the bush went quiet, something dangerous was near. Every movement, every breath became a piece of data. To the untrained eye, the veldt was a random, chaotic canvas. But to the scout, it was alive with language, a living, breathing narrative unfolding second by second. The Zulu called this skill Ugaloa Ingomoyatu, see with the spirit. It was more than just sharp eyesight. It was intuition, honed and sharpened by years of intense observation, by a life lived in constant dialogue with the natural world. They said that when a true scout focused, the wind itself would bend to show him the path. It was a state of being so attuned to the environment that the scout and the land became one. This connection wasn't just about reading the present moment, it was also about communicating across distances and time. Scouts didn't carry letters or parchments. Their messages were woven directly into the fabric of the landscape. They communicated through symbols: a stick bent in a certain way, a small pile of stones, or a knot tied in a reed. Each message was simple, yet carried meaning deep enough to change the fate of a battle. A pile of 3 stones might mean safe passage. 4 could warn enemy near. A bent twig pointing east was a clear instruction. Follow this way. These weren't written languages in the way we understand them today. They were living codes, passed down from one generation to the next through rigorous training, ritual, and shared experience. This was a knowledge that couldn't be learned from a book. It had to be lived, breathed, and practiced until it became second nature. This system of silent communication allowed warriors to coordinate movements over vast distances, to set ambushes with precision, and to relay vital intelligence without a single word being spoken aloud. It was a testament to their ingenuity and their profound understanding of their world. Let's pause here for a moment. The night air cools, and you can almost hear the whisper of feet over the sand. A world away from our own, yet deeply human. When the sun set and the landscape was cloaked in darkness, a different set of skills came to the forefront. Navigation was another art form, and the sky was their map. Every star was a direction, every constellation a trusted friend pointing the way home. The Southern Cross, the pointers, the bright beacon of Canopusthes weren't just celestial objects. They were reliable guides in a world without street signs or GPS. At dusk, they would read the shape and movement of the clouds to predict the coming wind and rain. At dawn, they watched the birds. A flock, flying low and tight, meant an approaching storm. High, scattered flight signaled clear skies ahead. Even the wind spoke in different dialects. A scout could tell by its feel and scent whether it was a dry wind from the interior, a cool, moist breeze from the coast, or if it carried the scent of grass smoke from a distant village. A scout's success and often his survival depended on how well he listened to these subtle conversations of the earth. To be a Zulu scout was to walk without needing roads, to cross vast valleys with nothing but memory as a compass. Their minds carried the geography of rivers, hills, and forests like poems, learned through chant and repetition around evening fires. These mental maps were incredibly detailed, passed down and refined through generations. They knew every landmark, every water source, every defensible position within their territory. It was a geography not of lines on paper, but of lived experience. The elders taught a profound truth. If you forget the path, close your eyes and breathe, the land remembers you. And often it did. This speaks to that deep, intuitive connection. The idea that the land itself held a memory of those who walked upon it with respect. Scouts could retrace trails in near-complete darkness with uncanny precision, guided by the feel of the slope under their feet, the direction of the wind on their skin, and a powerful, ingrained instinct. Their skill was not born of magic, but of a deep, profound intimacy with their place in the world. They knew which side of a termite mound faced north, catching the morning sun. They knew which rock would hold the warmth of yesterday's sun long into the cool night. Such memory could not be taught merely in words. It was lived, absorbed through years of repetition, until it became part of the flesh itself, an extension of their own senses. Let's pause here for a moment. The scout kneels by a trail, the world around him utterly still, listening not just with his ears, but with his entire being. This level of awareness is something we can all learn from. In our noisy, distracted world, taking a moment to simply observe, to listen, and to connect with our surroundings is a powerful act. Think about what it means to be so present. The scout's mind wasn't cluttered with abstract worries. His focus was absolute, anchored in the reality of the moment. The texture of the soil, the scent of the air, the distant call of a jackal, these were his truths. This state of heightened awareness wasn't just for survival. It was a way of life. It fostered a deep respect for the ecosystem they were part of. They understood the delicate balance of life and death, predator and prey, because they lived it every single day. This knowledge was holistic. It wasn't compartmentalized into botany, astronomy, and geology. It was one interconnected web of understanding. A particular plant told them not only about the soil type, but also its medicinal properties and the animals that fed on it. The behavior of those animals, in turn, could signal changes in the weather or the presence of danger. Everything was linked. This deep ecological wisdom is something modern society is only just beginning to rediscover and appreciate. The Zulu Scouts were, in essence, masters of applied ecology. They lived sustainably, not because of an abstract ethical code, but because their survival depended on maintaining the health and balance of their environment. They were true custodians of the land. As we wrap up our journey into the world of the Scout, let's reflect on the essence of their skill. It was a fusion of keen observation, rigorous training, cultural knowledge, and a spiritual connection to the land. They were more than just trackers or warriors. They were living libraries of ancestral wisdom, their bodies and minds perfectly attuned to the rhythms of the African veldt. They show us that the deepest knowledge comes not from conquering nature, but from listening to it and learning its language. Their legacy is a powerful reminder of a different way of seeing and being in the world, a way that is quieter, more observant, and infinitely more connected. It challenges us to look up from our screens, to feel the wind on our face, and to notice the small, miraculous details of the world around us. Have you ever wondered what it takes to become truly exceptional at something? To move beyond mere skill and into the realm of instinct? The ancient Zulu kingdom held a secret to this mastery, embodied by their elite scouts, the asterisk in lowly asterisk. Their training wasn't just about physical endurance. It was a profound spiritual journey, a way of life that tuned the human spirit to the very frequency of the wilderness. Join me as we uncover the sacred rituals and deep wisdom that transformed ordinary men into legendary paths. This isn't just a story about warriors. It's a timeless lesson in how to listen to the world and to ourselves. Before a single step was taken on a mission, the scouts began a ritual of purification. It started at dawn, at the river's edge. They would enter the cold, clear water, not just to wash away the dust of the kraal, but to cleanse their minds. They rubbed their skin with a mixture of fine ash and fragrant herbs, a symbolic act of shedding worldly distractions. From that moment on, their thoughts, their entire being, belonged to the mission alone. This wasn't about hygiene, it was about focus. It was a conscious decision to leave behind family, comfort, and personal desires, and to become a single, sharpened instrument for the kingdom. As the sun's first rays touched the valley, the asterisk Izangama, asterisk, the diviners and healers of the community, would arrive. They moved with a quiet reverence, carrying gourds that smoldered with sacred herbs, releasing plumes of smoke that carried prayers to the ancestral spirits. They would walk in slow, deliberate circles around the still scouts. Their voices a low, rhythmic chant, calling upon the ancestors for protection, for guidance, for clear sight. The scouts stood with their eyes closed, absorbing the vibrations of the diviner's rattle, feeling the ancient words wash over them. This was a crucial moment, a transfer of spiritual strength, a blessing that fortified not just their bodies, but their souls for the journey ahead. It was an acknowledgement that they were not walking alone. They were accompanied by the wisdom of generations. Adherence to taboos was not a suggestion. It was an absolute necessity, observed with unwavering devotion. A scout preparing for a mission would never eat certain foods. Meat from recently slaughtered cattle was forbidden, believed to carry the animal's distress. Sour milk was avoided, as it was thought to dull the senses. Even salt, a simple staple, was shunned. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were rooted in a deep understanding of how body and spirit are interconnected. They believed that consuming these things could anger the spirits or cloud their intuition, their most vital tool. The hours before dawn were cloaked in a sacred silence. No words were spoken. This quiet was a bridge, a sacred space between the waking world and the unseen realm of spirits and premonitions. To break a taboo was to invite disaster. It was believed that a scout who did so would have his shadow abandon him, leaving his physical form exposed and vulnerable to misfortune. His spiritual armor would be gone. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine the scene. The river mist hangs heavy over the still water, a pale blanket over the sleeping world. From a distant kraal, you hear the faint, fading beat of a drum, a final echo of the night's rhythm. The air is cool and clean, filled with the scent of damp earth and sacred smoke. This is the quiet power of preparation. Among the Zulu, there is a powerful saying, Isithinzi Siemba Thambili, which means, the shadow walks before the man. This isn't about a literal shadow. It's a metaphor for intuition, for that quiet, inner voice that warns of danger long before our eyes can see it. This intuition was considered the first and truest scout. The greatest warriors, the most successful leaders, trusted this internal sense as much as they trusted the sharpness of their spears or the strength of their shields. It was the ultimate guide, a sudden rustle of grass that felt out of sync with the wind's direction, an abrupt silence in the chorus of birdsong, the prickling sensation of hair on the back of their armsole. These were messages. They were signs from the environment that something was amiss. Some believed it was the ancestors whispering warnings from the spirit world. Others called it umoya, the spirit breath. The part of the soul that perceives what the physical eyes cannot. It's that gut feeling, that unexplainable sense of knowing that we've all experienced at some point in our lives. The scouts didn't just have this instinct. They cultivated it. They lived in harmony with it. Modern culture often teaches us to suppress fear, to fight it, to conquer it. The Zulu scouts did the opposite. They listened to it. Fear was not their enemy. It was their most trusted advisor. But it wasn't the loud, heart-pounding panic that paralyzes. It was a soft, precise signal, a subtle shift in the energy around them. It was like the deep vibration of a distant drum that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. This refined sense of fear guided their movements, telling them when to hide, when to move, and when to observe. They understood that fear, when listened to properly, is a survival mechanism of profound intelligence. It is the earth itself speaking through the body. Imagine a Zulu scout, standing alone on a rocky ridge as twilight bleeds across the sky. The day's heat is fading, and the cool evening breeze begins to stir. His eyes are closed, not in rest, but in deep concentration. He is feeling the wind, not just on his skin, but as a current of information. He can feel how it shifts and curls around the rocks, carrying scents from miles away, carrying sounds that a normal person would miss. He is a living antenna, tuned to the subtle frequencies of the wilderness. This wasn't a mystical power. It was the result of relentless training and a deep, abiding trust in the senses beyond sight. He had learned to quiet his own internal noise so that he could hear the whispers of the world around him. By the time night fell and the main army of the king settled down to rest around their campfires, the scouts were already far ahead, ghosts moving through the darkness. They were silhouettes against the vast, moonlit sky, indistinguishable from the rocks and trees of the veldt. Their minds were empty of chatter and worry, their bodies perfectly tuned to the rhythmic pulse of the African night. Every single sound was a piece of the puzzle. The sharp cry of a jackal wasn't just noise. It was information about the location of prey, or perhaps the presence of another predator. The hiss of wind through a narrow ravine, the snap of a twig, the distant call of a night jarich sound was analyzed, interpreted, and understood. Every shadow wasn't a threat. It was a possibility, an opportunity for concealment, or a sign of movement. They saw the landscape not as a collection of objects, but as a living, breathing entity that was constantly communicating with them. They no longer needed orders from a commander. Their training had been so deeply ingrained that it had become pure instinct. Their bodies knew what to do long before their conscious minds had to make a decision. The elders had promised that through this discipline they would achieve a state of perfect unity with their environment. And they had. They had become what they were meant to be, a part of the silence itself, unseen, unheard, and all-knowing. They were the eyes and ears of the king, moving through the land not as intruders, but as an integral part of its fabric. Let's pause again. The campfire crackles nearby, casting dancing shadows. The warmth feels good against the cool night air. Somewhere, out beyond the ridge, a lone night bird calls out. Its song isn't one of fear, but of certainty. It knows its place in the vast, dark tapestry of the night. This is the state the Scouts achieved. A confident belonging, a deep peace found not in safety, but in awareness. This ancient wisdom of the Zulu Scouts, this deep listening, is not lost to time. It's a skill we can all cultivate in our own lives. In a world filled with constant noise, notifications, and distractions, learning to be silent and listen is more valuable than ever. To listen to our environment, to our bodies, and to that quiet inner voice, our own isithancy, the world holds its breath before the storm of war. In this hush, the land breathes slowly. You can almost feel it. The oxen graze peacefully in the fields, their shapes dark against the fading light. Fires in the kraals burn low, sending thin whispers of smoke into the night sky. And out there, in the dark hills that ring the horizon, the first moves are being made. They are the Scouts. Ghosts before the storm, shadows that will shape what history later calls strategy. Imagine this. Long before the first war cry shatters the dawn, long before thousands of shields and spears clash, these men are already at work. They are the eyes and ears of the king, the unseen architects of victory. Their task is to map the unseen world, the enemy's world. They creep through tall grass and rugged terrain, their senses alive to every rustle of leaves, every distant murmur. Their mission is to find the enemy camps, to chart the hidden paths, to locate the precious water sources that will sustain an army. This intelligence wasn't just useful. It was the very foundation upon which the Zulu kingdom's military might was built. Think of the legendary King Shaka. His genius wasn't just in revolutionizing the spear or organizing his regiments. The Amabutho, his true brilliance, lay in how he used information. At the pivotal battle of G.C. Cockley Hill, it was the Scouts who gave him the lay of the land, who told him precisely where to position his forces to trap a much larger enemy. They showed him the terrain's weaknesses and strengths, allowing him to turn the landscape itself into a weapon. And again, at the Battle of Nindondakusaka, the fate of the conflict was decided by whispers carried on the night wind. Scouts reported the enemy's numbers, their morale, the location of their commanders. Every single movement of the mighty Zulu impi, every flanking maneuver, every feigned retreat, depended on the detailed reports of these silent warriors. They didn't just gather data. They painted a picture of the battlefield before a single drop of blood was spilled. How did they communicate this vital information across vast, dangerous distances? They were masters of a secret language, one spoken not with words, but with the sounds of the natural world. A specific bird call might signal the number of enemy patrols. The rhythm of a distant drum, so faint it could be mistaken for a heartbeat, could convey the size and direction of an approaching force. A cleverly placed pile of stones, a bent branch, these were the letters and words of their silent vocabulary. This was a language of pure survival and strategy, understood only by the initiated. Their greatest weapon was not the ikwa, the short stabbing spear, nor was it the iskilongu, the formidable cowhide shield. Their greatest weapon was silence. They moved without a sound, lived without a trace, and observed without being seen. A scout's victory wasn't celebrated with songs and dances in the great kraal. It was unseen, unheralded. His reward was a quiet, knowing nod from the king himself, a sign of ultimate trust and respect. That was enough. And so, when the time finally came for the warriors to charge, their feet thundering across the plains, they were not running into the unknown. They ran with a chilling certainty. They already knew where the enemy's defenses were weakest. They knew where the escape routes were. They knew where the enemy's fear would rise first. Why? Because the scouts had already walked through those fears the night before. They had tasted the enemy's anxiety in the air and mapped the geography of their dread. They were the unseen architects of war. While others fought in the brilliant, brutal light of day, they had already conquered in the silence of the night. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine us sitting around a fire, the flames crackling softly, casting dancing shadows. The vast African sky is a blanket of stars above us. It's in moments like this, in the quiet, that you can almost feel the presence of those scouts, their spirits still watching from the dark hills. This is a story that demands stillness to be truly understood. Now, as we sit here in this quiet, it's important to remember the cost. This work was perilous beyond imagination. Many scouts never returned. They were lost in enemy lands, their bodies never recovered, their stories left untold. They were buried without songs, their names fading like footprints in the sand. There were no monuments built for them, no grand tales woven into the epic poems sung by the Mbonji. Their legacy was of a different kind. Their influence, their spirit, echoed through generations. It wasn't contained within the borders of the Zulu kingdom. As the Mafekan, the great scattering of peoples, reshaped the map of southern Africa, these methods traveled. The Ngoni people, who migrated as far as modern-day Malawi and Tanzania, carried these tactics with them. The Gaza Kingdom in Mozambique, founded by the Zulu general Soshangaine, built its military strength on these very principles. The methods of the Zulu scout patience, meticulous observation, iron discipline, and the mastery of silence outlived their very names. They became a part of the deep, strategic DNA of military leaders across the continent. Their story teaches us something profound about power. It's not always about the loudest shout or the strongest blow. Sometimes true strength lies in what is unseen, in the quiet, diligent work done in the shadows. It's a testament to the idea that the deepest impact is often made by those who seek no credit, whose only reward is the success of the whole. Think about the discipline it took to lie still for hours, mere feet from an enemy encampment, every muscle screaming, every nerve on fire, to resist the urge to flee when a patrol passes so close you can hear their breathing, to memorize every detail, the number of huts, the placement of guards, the mood of the men, and carry it all back through hostile territory. This wasn't just bravery. It was a form of mental and spiritual fortitude that is hard for us to even comprehend today. These scouts were more than just soldiers. They were naturalists, psychologists, and geographers, all rolled into one. They had to understand the behavior of animals to mimic their calls perfectly. They had to understand human nature to predict an enemy's reactions. They had to read the land like a map, knowing which ridges offered the best vantage points and which riverbeds offered the safest passage. Their knowledge was holistic, drawn from a deep, intimate connection with their environment. And so, the next time you hear the stories of the great Zulu battles, of Shaka's military genius and the might of the Impi, remember the silent figures who made it all possible. Remember the men who moved like whispers in the dark, whose victories were won in the quiet hours before dawn. They were the first to face the danger, the first to understand the enemy, and the first to lay the foundations for victory. Their legacy isn't written in stone, but it's carried on the wind that blows across the hills of Zululand. A timeless reminder that the most important stories are often the ones told in silence. Now, the world shifts. The old wars of spear and shield, of honor-bound regiments clashing on open plains, begin to meet a new world. A world of gunpowder and greed. Our scout, once a figure moving between regiments of his own people, now finds himself caught not just between armies, but between entire empires. Imagine this moment. A Zulu scout, his skills honed in the subtle arts of tracking and observation, suddenly encounters something entirely new. He sees the strange uniforms of colonial forces, hears the sharp, unfamiliar crack of a rifle, and witnesses the construction of forts that defy the logic of traditional warfare. It's a collision of worlds. Some scouts were captured during these encounters. Their knowledge of the land, the languages, the people was a resource too valuable to waste. They were forced to become interpreters, unwilling bridges between their own kingdoms and the encroaching powers. Others, driven by a keen instinct for survival, adapted. They began to learn, piecing together the strange sounds of English or Dutch. They deciphered the curious markings on colonial maps, understanding that these lines and symbols represented a new way of controlling the land they knew so intimately. They became translators, not just of words, but of cultures. Their loyalties, once clear and simple, were now stretched thin, tested daily by the sheer necessity of staying alive in a world that was rapidly changing beneath their feet. The role of the scout evolved from a purely military one to that of a spy in the deepest sense. They would walk into enemy forts, not with weapons drawn, but disguised as humble traders. In their hands, they carried woven baskets filled with grain, strings of dried meat, or blocks of precious salt. But their minds were weapons. Their eyes, accustomed to scanning distant horizons for the slightest sign of movement, now memorized the height of fortress walls, counted the number of cannons peering through the embrasures, and estimated the strength of the garrison within. Every interaction was a dance with death. A smile held too long, a blink that was just a fraction too slow. A single misplaced word any of these could betray them. Their lives hung on their ability to project an aura of harmlessness while their minds raced, gathering intelligence that could turn the tide of a conflict. But this work carried a heavy moral burden, a weight that settled deep in their souls. They were the first to truly see what was coming. They saw the future arriving on the horizon, not as a gradual dawn, but as an overwhelming storm. It was a future of rifles that could kill from a distance, of stark, unyielding borders drawn across ancient grazing lands, of treaties written in languages they were only just beginning to understand, and of betrayals that would shatter the foundations of their society. They saw the inevitable decline of the spear and the rise of the cannon. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that their world was being dismantled piece by piece, and they carried this terrible knowledge home with them. They would report the enemy's numbers, the layout of their camps, the readiness of their soldiers. But how could they communicate the deeper truth? How could they explain the existential threat that loomed? A threat that wasn't just about losing a battle, but about losing everything. They carried this knowledge in silence, their faces masks of calm, while their hearts were haunted by the visions of what was to come. There's an old Zulu saying, a whisper passed down through generations, that captures this feeling perfectly. To know what is coming and be powerless to stop it is the heaviest kind of wisdom. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine us around that fire again. The embers are glowing faintly now, casting long, dancing shadows. The night has deepened around us, and the sounds of the wild have grown more pronounced. It's in moments like this, in the quiet darkness, that the weight of such stories can truly be felt. The tragedy of the scout's position is layered with bitter irony. After the wars, after the subjugation of the Zulu kingdom, many of these same scouts, with their unparalleled knowledge of the terrain, were sought out by the very forces they had once fought against. Some were employed as guides by the British or the Boers. They led colonial columns through winding valleys and over treacherous mountain paths. They knew like the back of their own hands. In a cruel twist of fate, their expertise, once a shield for their people, was now being used to help solidify the power of their conquerors. They were, in many cases, unknowingly helping to shape the very campaigns that would break their own people's last vestiges of power. It's a heart-wrenching paradox. The skills that made them protectors were turned into tools of occupation, but not all chose this path. Others simply vanished. They couldn't bear the thought of leading strangers through their ancestral lands, of being complicit, even passively, in the new order. These scouts disappeared back into the wild, into the deep forests and secluded mountains that had always been their sanctuary. They chose the solitary life of a hermit over the unbearable weight of being seen as a betrayer. They melted back into the landscape, their stories becoming whispers on the wind. Even today, in the rolling hills of KwaZulu, if you speak to the old families, you might hear tales of them. They are remembered not by name, but by a title that speaks to their unique, and often tragic, place in history. They are called those who walked between shadows and nations. It's a testament to their complex legacy men who navigated the treacherous twilight between two worlds. Their stories a solemn reminder of the price of knowledge and the cost of change. Their path was one of solitude, caught between loyalty and survival, between the world that was and the world that was to be. When the last spear was thrown and the final war cry echoed into silence, the battlefields of Zululand fell quiet. But for the scouts, the silence was of a different kind. It was a silence that followed them home, a weight in the air that only they could feel. They returned not as heroes draped in glory, but as ghosts walking among the living. Their eyes, once sharp enough to pierce the horizon, now held a distant, haunted look. Their hearts, once beating in rhythm with the war drums, were now unnervingly quiet. They had seen the chaos, the bravery, the fall of friends and foes. They had navigated the whispers of the long grass and the secrets of the dawn mist. But these were stories they could not tell. The oral codes of the Zulu regiments were strict, absolute. Boasting was forbidden. What a scout witnessed in the theatre of war was a burden they carried alone. It was a sacred, terrible knowledge locked away behind a wall of tradition and duty. Their wives, who felt the new distance in their touch. Their brothers, who saw the shadows in their eyes. Their children, who wondered why their father's laughter no longer filled the kraal none of them would ask. They understood, in a way that needed no words, that some doors must remain closed. And so, the scouts' memories, rich and harrowing, were left to fade, not into oblivion, but into the realm of myth. They became figures half-remembered, woven into the fabric of Isibongo, the praise poetry of the people. The verses spoke of them in riddles and metaphors. Those who see but do not speak, the poets would chant, who walk yet leave no dust behind. They were the watchers, the silent guardians, whose greatest battles were now fought within the landscape of their own minds. Their legends grew, whispered round the evening fires. It was said they could walk through a field of dry leaves without making a sound, that they knew the language of the hawk and the chameleon. But these were just echoes of a deeper truth, a way for the community to grasp the immensity of what these men had endured. The weight of their unspoken history manifested in strange and profound ways. Some scouts were said to hear voices in the wind, especially on nights when the moon was thin and the air was still. They would stand at the edge of the village, listening, and claim to hear the spirits of fallen warriors, both Zulu and folk calling them by name. Not in anger, but in a shared, eternal sorrow. It was as if the battlefield itself was trying to speak through them, to release the stories held captive in the soil. Were these hallucinations born of trauma, Or was it something more? A connection to the spiritual world, forged in the crucible of war? We, from our modern vantage point, can only speculate. But for them, it was real. Others found a different path to peace. They became Isinyanga, the healers, or chose the solitary life of hermits. They were drawn to the rivers, to the constant, soothing murmur of the water. There, they would sit for hours, sometimes days, not speaking, just listening. They explained that they were learning to listen again, but this time not for the snap of a twig or the distant tramp of feet, but for the voices of peace, for the rhythm of the living world that war had almost deafened them to. The river, with its endless flow, seemed to offer a form of cleansing, a way to wash away the blood and the dust from their souls. They would gather herbs by the water's edge, their knowledge of the land now used to mend rather than to scout for conflict. They were still guardians, but now they guarded life, not territory. Their skills, honed for war, were repurposed. The same keen observation that could spot an enemy impi from miles away could now identify the faintest sign of illness in a child. The same patience that allowed them to lie motionless for a day could now be used to wait for a rare medicinal plant to bloom. They had walked the path of destruction, and in its aftermath, they chose the path of restoration. They became custodians of a different kind of knowledge, one that healed the community they had once fought to protect. The children of the village would watch these quiet men with a mixture of awe and fear. They were living legends, tangible links to a heroic, brutal past. A grandfather might point to a solitary figure by the river and whisper, "There walks a man who spoke with the shadows. He knows the secrets the earth keeps." These men didn't need to recount their exploits. Their presence was a story in itself. Their silence was more powerful than any boast. Their quietude a testament to the profound cost of survival. Their legacy wasn't in the monuments of stone, but in the unshakable peace they eventually found and shared with those around them. The seasons turned. The grass grew green again over the old battlefields. The iron-rich soil, once stained red, slowly returned to its natural hue. The physical scars on the land began to heal, just as the physical wounds on the warriors had. But the spiritual echo remained. It lingered in the praise songs, in the folklore, and in the quiet dignity of the men who had seen it all. They had been the eyes of the army, the first to see the danger and the last to forget it. They carried the history of their people not on their shields, but in their souls. And so we come to the end of their trail. The battlefields sleep, but the scout's spirit still walks their dust. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire is almost out now. Only the stars keep watch. And beneath their gaze, the scout's shadow stretches into eternity. Reminder that history is not only made by those who are seen, but by those who saw first. The great kings and generals are remembered in the grand narratives, their names carved into the annals of time. But what of the scout, the one whose footprint was the first to mark the path, whose keen eye averted disaster, whose silent knowledge shaped the outcome of battles that would define a nation? Their story reminds us that the most important contributions are often the quietest. They are the unseen threads that hold the tapestry of history together. They are the roots that anchor the great tree of a people's story. While the warriors clashed in the open, the scout fought a lonely battle against uncertainty, fear, and the vast, unforgiving landscape. Their victory wasn't marked by the roar of a crowd, but by the quiet satisfaction of returning with the knowledge that would save their kin. As we look back, let us remember them. Let us honor the silence they kept, and the incredible strength it took to carry such a heavy burden. Their legacy is not one of violence, but of vigilance, not of conquest, but of protection. It is a legacy written in the wind, spoken by the river, and felt in the enduring spirit of the land they walked. They were the first witnesses, the silent guardians, and their story, though whispered, will never truly fade. The sun climbs slowly, a silent fire over the royal kraal. Its first rays catch the polished tips of spears, thousands of them lined up in perfect, deadly order. Regiments stand ready, their chants a low rumble like distant thunder. Yet, amidst this sea of muscle and might, a few figures stand slightly apart. They aren't the tallest, nor the loudest, but they possess a stillness, a profound calm that sets them apart. These are the king's eyes, Shaka's chosen watchers of the unseen, his masters of silence and shadow. These men were not selected for brute strength or their ferocity in battle. They were handpicked, one by one, for entirely different qualities: immense patience, unwavering precision, and an almost supernatural ability to observe. They were men who spoke little but saw everything. They were the keepers of secrets, trusted with knowledge that no one else could ever know. While the other regiments trained for the clamor and chaos of war, these men trained for its opposite: absolute, perfect silence. They learned to move without a sound, to exist without being noticed, to become ghosts walking in broad daylight. There's a saying from an old general, a man who understood the intricate dance of power. He once remarked, "A man who can walk unseen can guard a king without ever drawing a sword." This was the core philosophy of the king's eyes. Their battlefield was not the open plain, but the space between whispers. The glance between two rival chiefs, the shadow that falls behind a royal messenger. Their duty was to protect the king not just from spears and shields, but from plots, deception, and betrayal. Their responsibilities were vast and varied, stretching far beyond the confines of a traditional military role. They were the silent observers in the courts of rival chiefs, their faces unknown, their presence unfelt. They would follow messengers on long journeys, not to intercept them, but to see who they met along the way. What other messages might be passed in secret? They watched every visitor who came to the royal kraal, whether they arrived with lavish gifts or with honeyed words of gossip. No detail was too small, no observation insignificant. They guarded the winding paths that connected the various royal kraals, a network of arteries vital to the kingdom's health. They ensured that no one, absolutely no one, approached unannounced. Imagine the skill required to be a constant presence, a living security system without ever being seen. Their reports were never written down, never spoken in a crowded court. They were whispered directly into the king's ear, often at the quietest hours, at the first light of dawn before the world awoke, or deep in the stillness of the night when all others were asleep. This was a trust built on silence, a bond stronger than any public declaration. Shaka, a master strategist, understood the immense power of information. He knew that what you see is only half the story. What you don't see. What happens in the shadows is often what truly shapes the future. He valued these silent watchers immensely, but he didn't reward them with public praise or grand titles. That would defeat their very purpose, painting a target on their backs. Instead, his rewards were subtle but substantial. He granted them fertile land, large herds of cattle, and his deep, hidden respect. Their names were never sung in the great war chants, their deeds never recounted around the communal fires, but their families prospered. Their descendants lived comfortably for generations, a quiet testament to the service their ancestors had rendered in the shadows. Their legacy was not fame, but security, a quiet prosperity that outlasted the echoes of war. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine the scene. The fire in the great hut flickers low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and the hum of 1,000 unseen stories, 1,000 secrets held within the kraal. It's in this atmosphere that the true power of the king's eyes can be felt. They were more than just spies or scouts. They were a living embodiment of a delicate balance. They represented the equilibrium between unwavering loyalty to their king and a life of profound solitude. To be effective, they had to be separate, to live on the periphery. They also walked the fine line between knowing everything and keeping it all silent. Imagine the burden of carrying secrets that could shatter alliances or start wars, and the discipline required to hold your tongue, to report only to one man. They were warriors, yes, but warriors of a different kind, warriors beyond war. Their strength was not in violence, but in vision. Not in the charge, but in the patient wait. And as the Zulu kingdom grew, as its borders expanded and its influence spread like a rising tide, it was often their unseen footprints that marked the way forward. Before the regiments marched, before the diplomats were sent, the king's eyes had already been there. They had walked the land, understood its challenges, observed its people, and mapped the path of least resistance. They were the silent architects of an empire, their work done long before the first spear was ever thrown. They were the quiet foundation upon which a great kingdom was built. Their training was as unique as their role. It wasn't about drills and formations. It was about attuning the senses to a level most people can't even imagine. They learned to read the land like a scroll. A bent blade of grass wasn't just grass. It was a sign of someone's passing, and by its condition, they could tell how long ago. A disturbed pebble on a path could reveal the haste of the traveler. The call of a bird wasn't just a sound, it was an alarm, a signal that a stranger was moving through its territory. They learned to mimic these sounds, to use the language of nature itself as their own secret code. Their most important skill, however, was mastering the art of being forgettable. They learned to blend into any environment. In a bustling market, they could become just another face in the crowd. A merchant, a farmer, someone you would look at but never truly see. In the wilderness, they could melt into the landscape, becoming one with the rocks and the tall grass. This required an incredible level of self-control and mental discipline. It was a form of meditation, a state of being where the ego dissolves and only the mission remains. They erased themselves so that they could better see others. Think of the psychological toll. To live a life where your greatest successes must remain your own private knowledge. To know you have saved the king or averted a war, but to receive no public acknowledgement. Your only reward is the continued stability of the kingdom and the quiet nod from Shaka himself. This required a special kind of person, one motivated not by glory, but by a deep, profound sense of duty. Their satisfaction came from the successful execution of their task, from the knowledge that they were the unseen guardians, the silent pillars supporting the entire structure. These men also served as a private council of sorts. Because they moved among the common people, unnoticed, they heard the true feelings of the populace. They knew which chiefs were loved and which were feared. They understood the hardships of a village suffering from drought or the rising anger over a new tax. This unfiltered information was priceless to a ruler like Shaka. It allowed him to govern, not just with force, but with an awareness of his people's state of mind. He could preempt dissent, offer aid where it was most needed, and maintain a connection to his subjects that other rulers, surrounded by fawning courtiers, could only dream of. The king's eyes were his connection to the truth. Their legacy is a fascinating one because it's almost invisible. You won't find statues of them. Their stories are not the grand epics, but their influence is woven into the very fabric of the Zulu kingdom's success. They represent the idea that true power isn't always loud. It isn't always displayed with pomp and ceremony. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in silence, in observation, and in the quiet, unseen actions of a few dedicated individuals. They are a reminder that in history, as in life, the most important stories are often the ones that are never told aloud. They were the kingdom's silent pulse, felt by the king, but unseen by the world. Far from the clamour and dust of the regiments, nestled near sacred rivers and beneath the watchful eyes of ancient trees, the scouts made their homes. They didn't seek the warmth of the communal fire or the boisterous laughter of the crowd. Instead, they preferred the company of the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet language of the earth. People would whisper that they were touched by the wild. A knowing look, a stillness that was both calming and unsettling, set them apart. They were too quiet, their senses too sharp, their gaze too knowing. They moved through the world as if they were a part of it, not just living on it. When they returned from their long, silent missions, a space would naturally form around them. Even the women and children of the kraal, usually so full of life and questions, would give them a wide berth. It wasn't out of fear, not exactly. It was a form of respect for what they carried within them. Their eyes held the shimmer of distant, sun-scorched plains, the deep shadows of forbidden valleys, and the cold light of stars in places no ordinary warrior would ever dare to walk. They had seen too much. To disturb a returning scout was considered unwise, like stirring old, powerful spirits that were best left to their slumber. The silence they brought back with them was heavier than any story they could tell. Within the intricate military hierarchy of the tribe, the scouts were living paradoxes. They were both feared and deeply revered. Young, ambitious warriors would watch them from a distance, their hearts filled with a mixture of awe and aspiration. They dreamed of possessing that same quiet confidence, that ability to melt into the shadows and reappear with knowledge that could turn the tide of a conflict. Yet, for all the glory associated with them, very few truly wanted the burden they bore. The solitude, the constant vigilance, the weight of holding the fate of their people in their observations, it was a heavy cloak to wear. When a scout entered a gathering, a palpable shift would occur. The air would thicken with respect. Even seasoned generals, men who commanded hundreds, would instinctively lower their voices, their boisterous commands softening to a murmur. A scout didn't need a high rank or ornate adornments to command respect. His presence was enough. His silence was his authority, a testament to the unseen dangers he had faced and the vital secrets he held. He spoke little, but when he did, every word was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples felt by all. His authority came not from a title granted by a chief, but from the land itself. Their roles often evolved as they aged. The sharpest among them, those whose bodies could no longer endure the grueling long-range patrols, became trainers for the next generation. But this was no ordinary warrior training. They didn't just teach how to track or how to fight. They guided carefully selected youths through rigorous mental and spiritual conditioning. They taught them how to listen to the silence, how to read the wind, how to feel the intentions of an enemy before a single spear was thrown. They taught them that the greatest weapon was not the blade in their hand, but the stillness in their mind. These lessons were imparted not in loud drills, but in quiet moments by a riverbank or deep within the forest. Others became trusted counselors to the chiefs and elders. Their counsel was unique. They didn't issue orders or declare strategies. Instead, they advised through riddles, parables, and quiet, almost casual warnings. A scout might mention how the river birds were flying south earlier than usual. a subtle hint about changing weather patterns that could affect a planned campaign. Or he might tell a story about a clever jackal that outsmarted a pride of lions, a metaphor for how a smaller force could overcome a larger one through cunning. An old, respected elder once perfectly captured their essence when he said, "A scout never commands. He only suggests sand, the wise listen." Their wisdom was a guiding light, not a forceful push. They were, in essence, living libraries of memory. In an age before written maps and detailed records, everything was stored within their minds. They held intricate maps of landscapes that spanned hundreds of miles, charting every river, every mountain pass, every hidden spring. They memorized the subtle signs of their enemies: a displaced stone, a broken twig, the specific way a fire was built. They held the very rhythms of the natural world within them, the migration patterns of animals, the fruiting times of trees, the cycles of the moon and stars. This knowledge was their power, a sacred trust passed down through generations, ensuring the survival and prosperity of their people against all odds. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine yourself sitting with them. The river murmurs softly beside you. The night air is cool and carries the gentle, rhythmic hum of crickets. The fire casts a low, flickering light on their faces, etched with the lines of wisdom and experience. Spears are laid aside. In this quiet, you can almost feel the depth of their knowledge, the weight of their responsibility. This is where the real learning happens, not in the noise of battle, but in the heart of stillness. This connection to the earth was the source of their strength, and it was to the earth they would ultimately return. When the time came, when their steps grew slow and their keen eyes began to fade, many scouts refused the traditional burial rites within the kraal. They had spent their lives on the periphery, in the wild, untamed spaces, and they wished to remain there in their final rest. They would ask to be laid to rest, not in a marked grave, but beneath the sprawling branches of a wild fig tree or on a rocky outcrop, overlooking a valley they had guarded for a lifetime. They wanted to be closer to the earth that had once hidden them, sheltered them, and spoken to them in its silent tongue. They believed that the land itself, the wind in the grass, and the stones in the riverbed would remember their service better than any carved stone or spoken eulogy. Their legacy wasn't in monuments, but in the continued safety of their people, in the trails they blazed that were still walked by others, and in the quiet wisdom they passed down. Their bodies would return to the soil, becoming one with the very landscape they had dedicated their lives to protecting. And, in a way, they never truly left. Their spirit remained in the whisper of the wind through the tall grass, a silent, eternal watch over the land they loved. Time, as they say, is a river. It flows ever onward, carving new landscapes, washing away old empires, and turning stone fortresses into dust. The great Zulu kingdom, a name that once thundered across the southern plains of Africa, is now a chapter in history books. The mighty armies, the clashing shields, the soaring war cries, they have all faded into the silence of the ages. But not everything is lost to that river of time. Some things are too light to sink, too resilient to be washed away. Some things remain, not in stone or steel, but in the dust, in the wind, and in the words whispered by descendants. The spirit of the scouts, the asterisk, in lowly asterisk, endures. They were the unseen, the unheard, the silent guardians of the kingdom. Their role was not to fight in the glorious front lines, but to be the eyes and ears of the king, to see what was coming long before the storm broke. Their contribution was so profound, so vital, that it became almost sacred. In the grand tapestry of Zulu praise poetry, the asterisk, Azibongo asterisk, you won't find their names listed alongside the great warriors or chieftains. Their legacy is far more subtle. They are mentioned only indirectly, in poetic, almost cryptic phrases. They are called those who saw before the storm, a testament to their foresight. They are revered as the eyes that blinked not, a tribute to their unwavering vigilance. Their names weren't erased by forgetfulness, not at all. They were veiled by reverence, shrouded in an aura of respect so deep that to speak their names directly would be to diminish their mystique, their sacred duty. It was the ultimate honor to be so essential that your identity merged with the very concept of protection itself. Think about that for a moment. In a culture that celebrated individual heroism and proclaimed the deeds of its warriors, the greatest honor was reserved for those who operated in complete anonymity. Their reward wasn't fame or glory. It was the continued safety and prosperity of their people. They were the silent architects of victory, the invisible foundation upon which the kingdom stood strong. Their work was done in the shadows, on lonely hilltops, and in the quiet pre-dawn hours. They read the signs of the earth, a disturbed flock of birds, an unusual pattern in the dust, the scent of a distant fire on the wind. These were their texts, their scriptures. They didn't just look, they saw. They didn't just hear, they listened. Their senses were honed to a degree that bordered on the supernatural, but it wasn't magic. It was discipline, patience, and a profound connection to the land they were sworn to protect. Today, centuries later, that connection has not been broken. All across modern KwaZulu-Natal, families proudly trace their bloodlines back to these watchers of the unseen. The stories are no longer state secrets whispered in the royal kraal, but treasured family heirlooms passed down from one generation to the next. Around crackling fires, as the African night wraps the world in its deep, starry blanket, elders will tell the children about their ancestors. They speak of men and women who could walk like the wind, moving through the bush without leaving a trace. Their footsteps as silent as falling leaves. They recount tales of those who knew what others could not see, who could sense the subtle shifts in the spiritual and physical landscape that foretold danger or opportunity. These stories are more than just thrilling adventures from a bygone era. They are living lessons, parables carrying a timeless wisdom. They teach the young ones that power does not always need to shout to be heard. It doesn't always need to be demonstrated with a show of force. Sometimes, the greatest power is the one that whispers. It's the power of observation, of patience, of understanding a situation so completely that you can influence its outcome without anyone even knowing you were there. It's the art of quiet influence, of strategic patience. The scouts didn't win battles with spears. They won them with information, with foresight, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the terrain better than the enemy. And from these ancient lessons, these fireside tales, rise modern virtues. The teachings of the asterisk in lowly asterisk are woven into the fabric of everyday life. Think about it. The wisdom of listening before speaking. How often in our modern, noisy world do we rush to give our opinion, to dominate the conversation, without first taking the time to truly listen and understand? The Scouts teach us that information is gathered in silence. The virtue of watching before acting. The impulse to react, to jump into a situation without a full understanding, is a common failing. The Scouts' legacy reminds us to pause, to observe, to gather all the facts before making a move. A rash decision can lead to disaster, while a patient, well-informed action can secure victory. And perhaps the most profound lesson of all, the art of leading without needing applause. The Scouts were leaders in their own right. Their intelligence guided the decisions of kings and generals. Yet they sought no recognition. Their satisfaction came from the success of the collective, not from personal accolades. This is a powerful model of leadership for today, leading from behind, empowering others, focusing on the mission rather than the ego. The Scouts' ultimate gift to time, their enduring legacy, is not a manual on warcraft or tactics. It is something far more universal and far more valuable. It is the art of awareness. Awareness of our surroundings, awareness of others, and most importantly, awareness of ourselves. It's about being present, being observant, and understanding the subtle currents that flow beneath the surface of everyday life. There's an old Zulu saying, "The shadows remember." It speaks to the idea that the past is never truly gone. It lingers in the landscape, in the memory of the land itself. The hills and valleys that once concealed the Scouts still hold the echoes of their silent footsteps. And so do we, the descendants of the Scouts, and all who hear their story carry that memory forward. We become the living repositories of their wisdom. It's a responsibility and an honor. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine the scene. The sun has set, the embers of the fire are glowing, casting a warm, soft light on the faces gathered around. The air is still. The story hangs in the silence, its weight and its truth settling into our hearts. The embers fade, the heat recedes, but the story lingers in the dust, ready to be stirred to life by the next telling. Perhaps that is the Scouts' truest legacy. It's not about battles won or enemies outsmarted. It's a deeper, more personal lesson. It's a lesson that teaches us that greatness does not need to be seen. It doesn't need a monument or a praise song. True greatness, enduring greatness, only needs to be felt. It's felt in the quiet places, in the moments of reflection, in the silent landscapes where the ancestors still walk. It's a feeling of connection, of belonging, of being part of something much larger and much older than ourselves. It's the quiet whisper of the past, reminding us to watch, to listen, and to understand. The night is nearly over. The hills of KwaZulu-Natal breathe with the soft gold of a coming dawn. Mist clings to the valleys where battles once raged, and rivers wind through the earth like memories unwilling to be forgotten. Here, where the grass bends gently under the morning light, the footsteps of Scouts fade but not their spirit. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire before us burns low, its smoke curling lazily toward the sky. You can almost hear the echo of their tread, those quiet men who walked in the shadows of history. They asked for no songs, no drums, no cheers of triumph. Their victories were not loud enough for poets, yet loud enough for the earth itself to remember. For it was their silence that protected the noise of kingdoms, their patience that guarded the thunder of war. As the elder's voice softens, he looks beyond the fire, eyes tracing invisible paths across the plain. He speaks of a discipline learned from the earth, where every sound, every breath, every shadow carried meaning. To be a Scout was to master one's heartbeat, to speak with the wind, and to let one's spirit walk a few steps ahead, always searching, always warning, always watching. In the deep rhythm of his voice, you hear a truth that belongs not just to warriors, but to all who endure quietly. The truth that strength is not noise, and that courage sometimes means standing unseen. It is the art of knowing when to move and when to wait, when to listen and when to vanish like mist in the morning sun. Let's pause here for a moment. The world exhales, and even the birds seem to wait before singing. He tells of Scouts who returned home and sat in silence by the kraal fires, who held their children without words, who knew that what they carried could never be spoken. The kingdom saw their faces, but not their burdens. Yet it was these burdens that built the quiet foundations of an empire. The elder smiles faintly, stirring the coals with his staff. "Do you see," he whispers, "how even the sand remembers where they walked?" And for a moment, the wind seems to shift, drawing a pattern through the dust as if invisible feet still move through time itself. When the Zulu scouts walked, they walked not for glory, but for duty. And when they vanished into the bush, the kingdom held its breath until they returned. They were the thin thread between peace and chaos, and though the world remembers kings, it is the unseen who make kingdoms endure. Let's pause here for a moment. The embers glow like tiny suns. The night sighs into silence. As dawn stretches its first full breath, the elder's story draws to its end. The rhythm of his words fades into the hush of early morning, a song that began in battle and ends in peace. You feel the weight of time, not heavy, but deep. The kind of quiet that comes after understanding. He looks at you, and his voice drops to a whisper. Remember this: it is not the warrior who shouts loudest that shapes the world. It is the one who listens deepest. And as the last flame flickers out, his shadow blends with the earth, leaving only the soft hum of crickets, the cool breath of dawn, and the knowing that the story never truly ends. It simply returns to the soil. The wind rises, brushing past the baobab's broad roots. The plains stretch endlessly, and somewhere, perhaps just beyond the ridge, another story waits to be told. The elder's final words settle into the air like dust illuminated by morning light. The hoof prints fade. The drums fall silent, but the spirit of those nights still hums beneath the red earth. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If these stories speak to you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep these histories alive. We'll see you again under these same skies, under Baobab skies.